Good evening. Good evening. There you go. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Great Hall, and to many of you, welcome back to your own space of education. My name is Nader Tehrani, and as the Dean of the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture, I'm honored to host you here tonight at the Cooper Union. The Student Work Collection Database is an important body of work, and in many ways it characterizes the culture of Cooper Union in a particular way, not only as a historical archive of its work, but in seeing the project of learning through it, and in turn seeing the archives as a living protagonist of our pedagogies today. Some 5 years ago, before I was appointed dean, indeed, I suspect it was part of the luring mechanism, I was granted a private tour of the analysis exhibition that included many of your works. Well, it worked. Cooper Union got me, and yet I feel I won the possibility of entering into an education to which I myself did not have access prior. I continue to benefit from the archives and its intellectual mission on a daily basis. This is embodied in our lectures, exhibitions, internships, and yes, in events like this, when great architects and educators, most of who are our own alumni, come together and reflect on how this space of education created many schools of thought, as each of you projected forth in heterogeneous ways. To this end, the two panels tonight will hope to achieve at least two things: looking back and looking forward, not only in establishing the intricacies of a historical legacy, but also in the identification of the debates, conflicts, and polemics that cast paths forward, often towards different institutions, all of which have by now benefited from your many voices. There are many events tonight, so I'll try to be brief, but only to thank each and every one of you for accepting the invitation. I want to offer a special thanks to Stephen Hillier and his team in the archives for their tenacity in undertaking this project. I'd also like to welcome Kim Skopich back to Cooper Union. It is, after all, her formational role in the archives that has made us the beneficiaries of the wealth of drawings, texts, and information on which we can reflect tonight. Before we launch the evening, I'd also like to read a short message received from Renata Hayduk just hours ago. She writes, "I want to let you know how proud our family is of you both this evening as you launch the Student Work Collection Digital Archive. As you know, my dad dedicated his life to the education of the architect, and his students at Cooper were one of his greatest joys in his too short a life. The idea of the archive becoming a virtual site that is accessible to anyone who wants to see the incredible work done by the architecture students at Cooper is a remarkable moment for the Cooper Union Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture. This undertaking is nothing less than epic in its undertaking and continues the idea of education as a right, not a privilege, and access to the work of students and educators as part of the responsibility and ethos of a school. Cooper is continuing what my father always spoke about, the idea of the social contract. Today, with the launch of this site, people around the world will be able to see the force of the imagination of the educators and students who have thought about the work of architecture as transformative, and the role of the architect in society as a complex thinker who can push boundaries and ask questions about the nature of dwelling and the possibility of architecture in the creation of a better world. My mother, Gloria Fiorentino Hayduk, a Cooper Knight School, art school, 1949 graduate, by the way, is almost now 92. When I told her about the project and the event this evening, she said, "How marvelous. Your father would have been so happy about this." And she sends her best wishes to you all. I'm so sorry that I cannot join you this evening in person. Tonight, I have the privilege to listen to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright speaking here in Arizona. She will undoubtedly speak about her recent book on fascism. As I listen to her, I will be reminded that my father believed that education and access to education were part of the aforementioned social contract. And I'm always reminded that he deeply believed that education is one of the most important aspects of a democratic and just society. Congratulations upon the opening of the Archive of the Student Work. It is an act of faith in the power of education and the imagination. Fondly, Renata. So, welcome again to all of you who have joined us tonight, whether in person or on live stream. And please help me in welcoming Stephen Hillier to the podium.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us, and welcome back to those of you who have not been around in a while. Good to see a lot of familiar faces. I just want to frame a little bit about what we're doing here tonight, and what the project of the database is. The origins of the database are really embedded in a tradition that John Haydock formalized early in his tenure at Cooper Union to disseminate the work of the school through exhibitions and publications. This was really crystallized in 1971 when the School of Architecture was invited by the Museum of Modern Art to exhibit student work there. That exhibition and companion publication, and both entitled Education of an Architect, Point of View, and the traveling exhibition that followed really propelled the school's work into the foreground of architectural education. For almost 50 years now, the School of Architecture has recorded its pedagogy. Sure, thank you. Has recorded its pedagogy by documenting faculty-selected student work. Following the second volume of Education of an Architect in 1988, we formalized this process and documenting work from every annual end-of-year exhibition. The collective body of work, much of it previously unpublished, chronicles the evolving pedagogy of the school, and given Cooper Union's interdisciplinary approach to teaching architecture, in which the work of writers, filmmakers, poets, painters, and composers inspired and informed student work, we believe this collection will really speak to individuals from other disciplines. The first phase of the database that you'll see tonight documents work from the 1930s to the 1999-2000 academic year. This is a 3-year grant-funded effort. It was initiated to digitize the holdings of the archive and make them available to the public. And for me, it honors the legacy of John Haydock and the faculty he assembled as the first Dean of Architecture, and it celebrates the work of those individuals and the students they taught for several decades. Many of you here tonight. So what I would say is, to our knowledge, no other school has accumulated such a detailed and continuous record of its pedagogy or enabled a comprehensive web-based access to it. What would clearly be the story of truth is that we would not have been able to manifest this database without the generous support of our partners. And the Leon Levy Foundation has been an incredibly great champion of this effort. And I want to acknowledge founding trustee Shelby White, who's here with us tonight. As well as Jennifer Ellis, who manages the Foundation's Archives and Catalogs program, and President Rob Goldrich. They have been instrumental in elevating our collection and increasing awareness of it at many significant New York cultural institutions through the Foundation's annual Archives Roundtable program. This project also received support from the Metropolitan New York Library Council and the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, both federal organizations that early on recognized the significance of this collection. I'd like to thank Laura for her support of this project and for really embracing the idea that we should be getting our collections out into the world at Cooper Union. It's a really amazing thing. And I want to thank Nader and Elizabeth and Haley for their support of this project. It's really nice to have the space to be able to look backwards into the past while we are building content, publications, and exhibition toward the future. And I have to say, I need to thank Elizabeth specifically, because in 2014, when she was leading the School of Architecture at a very difficult time, she listened to me tell her what I wanted to do, and as she pointed out tonight, begrudgingly said yes, as long as she can figure out how to pay for it. And I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, Diana, Peter, Sue, Michael, Guido, Stan, Peggy, David, Laurie, Kyna, Toshiko, and Tamar, and Bradley. And I just want to say your work in this database is critical to the greater narrative of this school in a couple of different ways. And to my colleagues, Chris and Caitlin, we wouldn't be here tonight if it were not for them. Caitlin is the project manager, Chris is our collections manager, and he fundraises through grant writing for special projects. Yes, please. The level of care and detail that these two individuals have brought to this project is nothing less than astounding. The conversations that they've built together, the shorthand of dialogue and collaboration, and the incredibly precise work that they do has really elevated this project to a whole nother space. I want to thank Seth Kaufman, who's a 1993 graduate of the School of Engineering, and Maria Pazzarotti, a graduate of the School of Art, and their colleagues at Whirligig for helping us build this database on the front and back end. And I really need to thank Mindy Lang and Mark Rossi here at Cooper Union, because if it was not for them, the site would not have the design, the look and feel, and the interface that makes it very user-friendly. And I also have a friend in Siri Como McDonald who has helped shepherd our projects. Karen Berry, the attorney for Cooper Union, who's here tonight, who helped us navigate numerous challenging conversations and who probably came very close to losing her patience with us at times. I have colleagues in the IT department, Robert and Wayne, Kim Newman, who is really getting the word out on this project, and of course Anessa, my colleague, who does all things graphic. And a point, there are 50 students and former students who have assisted us on this project to date. Some of them handling images, some of them, 45 of them scanning. And my colleague Leah really helped with some of the aspects of getting the work online. And I would be wholly remiss if I did not thank Monica Shapiro, who helped us piece together there was a lot of missing information that Monica helped us piece together. She has an eagle eye. I often refer to her as the oracle of the School of Architecture. And of course, Robin Fitzsimmons and Mauricio Higuera. And a nod to our colleagues, Crystal and Margot, who helped organize this event tonight. A couple more things before I close. I want to make an announcement of a gift in the making from the estate of Lebbeus Woods. Alexandra Wagner, who's here with us tonight, has very generously offered to donate a trove of over 1,000 records encompassing syllabi, course descriptions, exercises, handwritten notes and drawings dating from 1996 to 2011. You can see some examples here. And in the coming weeks, we're going to be including some of this content on the database, and we're really hoping that this might encourage other current and former faculty members to do a little digging to see what other kind of content we can bring in, because it's really important to see the student work in the context of the assignments or the studio prompts that we're given. That's how you figure out much more significantly what a project is. And before I close, a huge thank you to everyone who's been hearing from us, sometimes numerous times, to our current and former faculty members who have been providing us with content for the site. It's an incredibly complicated thing to ask people to go back, 20, 30 years to think about their formative creative work, but almost all of those conversations have been quite positive. And speaking on behalf of my team, I just want to say a very grateful thanks to Tim, Alex, and Chailin. You'll be seeing a lot more of us now. And in closing, just about my role in all of this. My role in the ongoing project of the archive over the past 30 years has been to record the work of the school. And there have been numerous times whenever we've been able to share and celebrate aspects of the pedagogy. And I would tell you that 5 years ago, the thought of turning this archive inside out and putting it out into the world seemed unattainable. But for me, this project is the ultimate way that we can celebrate the pedagogy of the history of the pedagogy. And I use the word celebrate quite a bit because that was an environment that I first encountered when I came to this school, a place of great celebration. So now I'm going to ask my friend and former colleague and the founding director of the archive, Kim Skopich, to make some remarks. In my 10 years of working with Kim, I was given the opportunity to assist her with too numerous exhibitions and publications to possibly name, but they are significant in many ways. She is a consummate designer and bookmaker, and as you know, she worked closely with John for about 20 years. When I first walked into the archive, Kim, and I should say the archive was really a storage room turned workroom, Kim was literally finishing up the mechanicals for the second volume of Education of an Architect. She took me under her wing. She taught me a great deal of what I know about exhibitions and publications, and she became a very excellent collaborator. So Kim Skopich.
It's so wild to be back here. I came to Cooper Union in 1978 as a transfer student to the School of Architecture. To the School of Art. And I was a work-study student. I was probably the only student at that time who could type. And I got a job in the School of Architecture office. And after about 3 months, John Haydock, who was the dean, called me into his office and asked me if I would frame some drawings that he was going to exhibit at the Venice Biennale. I came to Cooper Union with a background in paper making and film, and I loved paper. And John pulled out these spiral-bound yellow notebooks with these amazing drawings in them. And we never really talked, I didn't know him, but I was so passionate about paper. I looked at him and I said, "Are you crazy? You make these beautiful drawings on notebook paper?" And he said, "Get out." A couple days later, I didn't go to work, I was kind of afraid. A couple days later, he called me and he said, "I really don't know anything about paper." So I took him to New York Central. I explained to him about archival qualities of paper. John was also really in love with rubber cement, and that was also full of acid. So during the first 2 years, while I finished my education at Cooper Union, I really kind of tried to supervise his archival practices so that these amazing drawings would have some kind of life. In 1980, when I graduated, John gave me the keys to a secret room. He had 2 secret rooms here at Cooper Union. One was in the mezzanine, and in that room was everything he had ever made, like since he was in high school. And I spent a year really organizing it all. And then we made a book called Mask of Medusa. Because of that trust, in 1982, he gave me another key to another room that was in the basement of the Hewitt building. And it was a storeroom, but it hadn't been used in years except for storage. And it had no floor, it was earth. And the room extended the vaults under the sidewalk, and we worked down there for many years. And every Monday after a wild weekend at McSorley's, of course the room was not very pleasant to be in. But that was the archive, and I was challenged. I was given a book. And in many ways, this was John's manifesto. I love the type. It says, "Education of an Architect, a Point of View, an exhibition by the Cooper Union School of Art and Architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York City, November 1971. This book and the exhibition are co-sponsored by the Architectural League of New York, the Department of Architecture and Design of the Museum of Modern Art, under an initiating grant from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts." That's a pretty long title. But it also represented the methodology of producing public projects, books, exhibitions. So, in 1982, I was given this key. It was full of all the projects from this book. The intent was to return those projects and to start collecting new work because John really wanted to do a second book, Education of an Architect 2. We worked on that book in the archive. The archive really was a drafting table with a wooden trellis that we clamped photo lights on. And in there, we photographed work, and I worked on the book with Professors Diane Lewis and Elizabeth Diller. The book was published in '88. In 1989, we did a project for Joseph Clyhus. And then in 1990, I wasn't really an official employee of Cooper Union, and the archive at that time wasn't really recognized as a department. I was here as a consultant, and the archive was really a dream, but it was really a dream to document the pedagogy, and in my translation of that, the archive was really a factory, and we produced work for publication and exhibition. So the archive was never really looking back, it was always looking forward. Stephen joined me in 1985, and we were colleagues for a long time. And as I think about time, I have been gone from Cooper Union now almost as long as the 23 years that I served here. The great thing about education is really about entrusting knowledge to the next generation. So it was interesting to me that when Stephen took over the archive, he brought his own ethos to it. And that really was, Stephen realized that that the archive itself was the book. My tradition of making books was always, I was interested in directing reading, and I was interested in directing reading. And in many ways, the archive as a database, as a book, fulfills my greatest dream, which is to have multiple readings from multiple points of view. It really is a history, our combined history. I was honored to be here. I was honored to be given the freedom actually to create something and the freedom to inspire. The archive was always kind of a haven for students, and during my tenure, we were probably, 200 people who worked in it. And when you see the database, there's so many stories, and we will all read it in different ways. We'll read it as the stories of our peers. We'll remember tears. We'll remember triumphs. We'll remember magical moments when students were beautiful and fabulous and glorious. So I can't believe that I'm here. John often would say, I can't remember the future. And we couldn't imagine back in 1982 when this all started that this moment would arrive. So I thank you all for allowing me to also be part of your history in this place. And congratulations to all of us.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Stephen. For the first panel, we've assembled a group of current and former faculty members to discuss the pedagogy of the school leading to the year 2000. While the content of the archives is still a work in progress, this aligns with the work done to date, and indeed also aligns with the span of John Haydock's teaching and deanship of the school. I'm reminded that we are just months away from the 20th anniversary of his passing, and so this is also a moment to historicize a passage of time that now, with some distance beyond and in addition to the necessary sentimentality, may reflect critically on some of the seminal intellectual constructs that have changed architectural education in America, if not globally. This panel is composed of Professor Diana Agrest, whose book, The Architecture of Nature, The Nature of Architecture, has recently been celebrated, Peter Eisenman, who's generously returned to teach the analysis studio this semester, Sue Ferguson Gussow, whose stubborn eye on hand drawing remains a legacy course like no other, Michael Sorkin, whose mastery of words reminds us of the slippery terrain between language and images, and Michael Webb, whose history of drawings have continued to expand our idea of thinking through representation itself. To help moderate, or should I say radicalize, this group of extraordinary voices, I invite Guido Zuliani to the stage, as they all are already. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I want also, one more time, to thank Stephen and the archive staff and the students that put so much work in this particular project. I also want to thank the member of this panel for being available to participate in this discussion. Because of the time limits of our panel, this is a long evening, I have decided to condense two separate considerations into one single introduction, which for reason of efficiency I will read. First of all, as a premise, I would like to say that I believe that the significance of an effort such as the publication of decades of work produced by the students of a school should go beyond its certainly remarkable documentary value and attempt to frame historically the specific intellectual and polemic contribution that the school had and may still have to offer to the architectural culture in general. I would like to focus the conversation in particular on the work produced from the mid-70s to the end of the 90s, which constitute about the 90% of the images present in the archive, and for reasons that I hope will be clear, become clear later. I will start by pointing out the drastic changes in the direction of a cultural project of the school, as it could be ascertained by the comparison of the two volumes of Education of an Architect. The first one published in 1971 and collecting the students' work produced between 1964 and 1970. The second published in 1988 and presenting the work produced roughly between 1973 and 1985. The first volume describes a body of work unfolding from within a specific paradigmatic frame, a disciplinary matrix with its sets of theorems, corollary, references, and vocabulary centered on the experiment that Haydock was conducting at the time, like the Texas houses or the diamond thesis, the fractional houses, the early version of the wall house. The 1988 volume presents a quite different, if not antithetical, portrait of the school. Their overall image is characterized by a series of diverging, heterogeneous directions, both in terms of the content of the research and the style of their presentation. A highly articulated assemblage, the complexity of which will in the following year only increase. It is with the reflection on this passage on the fast, almost sudden transformation from one cultural project into another, on its historical nature, implication, and eventual predicament that I would like to start the conversation. The school that emerged in the late 70s is a completely transformed Cooper, not only physically with the newly renovated building. It is the result of a new cultural project that may be described as the construction of a polycentric system of different discourses. A transformation produced by the influx of new members of the faculty, some of which coming via the Institute of Architecture who were studying from abroad, like, for example, Diana Agrest, who brought to the school her discourse on the urban form, by the subsequent emerging of a transdisciplinary attitude that inscribed visual art, literature, cinema, photography, medicine, semiotic, and other humanist discipline as a propulsive element of the design process. By the adoption of references for the design process of elements external to the traditional disciplinary field, ranging from musical instrument to tools, from appliances to elements extracted from the natural world, from anatomy and history. The consequence of this change will be the extreme heterogeneity of the work, apparently irreducible to a single synthetic interpretation. What I would like to propose to the panel is to attempt to frame this transformation of the school and its subsequent development within the emerging of what took the name of the postmodern condition, understood as the recognition of the end and ultimately untenability of meta-narrative as ideological construct able to orient within the wholeness of a singular structure, of a single univocal coherent set of norms and code, the human activity. A concept, the one of postmodernity, in the way in which I intended, different, if not opposite, from the one adopted by the aestheticized postmodernists of later date, officially inaugurated by the 1980 Biennale. As a follow-up, this is the first part, and the follow-up, in keeping with the idea of the connection between the nature of the work produced by the school and postmodernity, I would like for the panel to address what I define as a pedagogical axis to indicate a series of focuses or area of engagement that running in various forms through all the 5 years of the curriculum could be defined as a specific ethos of the school. The pedagogical axis, also due to the time frame that we have and that I define, are just 3, but they can be added, other can be added or substituted by the panelists. The first pedagogical axis is drawing. There is an important difference between the use of drawings in the work presented in the first education of an architect and the one presented in the second one. In the former, outlining drawings play a traditional role of descriptive notation and representation of designed project. In the latter, the role of the practice of drawings has been transformed into an exploratory and at the same time projective tool, essential to the unfolding of the design process. To underline the general importance attributed to the practice of drawing, I would just to mention that in 1975, with the appointment of Sue Gussow, the class of freehand drawings of figure was added as an essential component of the curriculum. I would also argue that because of the specific autonomy of the practice of drawings, that activity played the role of a sort of critical practice. The second pedagogical axis, one strictly related to the previous one, is analysis. I don't want to elaborate much about this, except for saying that directly or indirectly, explicitly or implicitly, an analytical attitude may be detected throughout the entirety of the design curriculum. Moreover, analysis as a kind of projecting hermeneutics could for me express a specific characteristic of a kind of architectural practice developed within the above-mentioned postmodern condition. The last axis that I would like for the panel to consider it concerned the city. It is a little more complex point because why the city became from 1976 on the specific subject of a distinct design studio, specifically the one taught by Diana Agrest in 4th year, it also appeared in different moments as a focus of other studios, and at the same time as a new interest in the personal work of some of the other members of the faculty, in particular Adok and Eisenman with their project from the late 70s and early 80s for Venice and Berlin. These are my introductory consideration, and now I would like to turn them to the member of the panel, my colleagues, which actually are the real actors of protagonists of this story, for their comment. I don't have a particular order to start with, but I will, whoever wants to respond or react to this consideration may start.
I'm looking either to my left or right. What are you looking at me?
No, I'm looking on the other side.
There you are. I'll talk.
Oh, good. We'll go in order.
Okay. No, I didn't say I wanted to talk. One of the nice things about aging is often you don't get to hear much of what's going on. And I must confess, although I share a desk right across from Guido, can hear him often, I didn't hear a word he said. I want to suggest that what we're here talking about is what I would call a pedagogy of modern architecture. And I would argue that the first pedagogy of modern architecture in this country began at the University of Texas in 1952 under the auspices of a Swiss architect, Bernard Hössli, who had worked for Le Corbusier and had come to reinvigorate the school at Texas. Along the way, he had met someone by the name of Colin Rowe and invited Colin Rowe to come to Texas. And Colin had run into people like Bob Slutsky and John Haydock, and they were also invited. So in 52, 53, 54, these people all came together in Texas. And I would argue that the curriculum of Cooper Union, which was the first school where the pedagogy of modern architecture actually was instantiated, was formulated at the University of Texas between Colin Rowe and John Haydock. And it's not surprising that the two schools of pedagogy, that is, the thinking about the discipline as a phenomena of the modern, took place at Cooper and took place at Cornell. It was a very different animal at Cornell, but I don't know it very well. But the animal of modern architecture that was here was certainly came from the energy and desires that John Haydock had. And he was as inspirational as he was unpredictable. I remember one marvelous day, we were having a pin-up jury at the end of a semester, and all the work of 25 or 30 students were on the wall of the studio. I don't know, Guido, if you were there the day that...
Possibly.
Probably. And we were praising certain drawings as being good ones, etc. And who walks in but the dean? And this is what he would always do. And he would look around. He didn't say much. And he looked and he looked and he looked. And he finally found the worst project in the class. It's not easy sometimes to miss those. And John went up to that project knowing that we were going to like it, let's say, or that not like it. And he pointed and he said one word, fresh, and walked out. And of course, what do you do then? That was the end of the day, but that was part of the pedagogical project. And the other thing that I remember with great fondness, because it was John's school, all of us were helpful lieutenants, but John ran the show like is probably necessary from a dean. And John would say, "We're having lunch." And I said, "Okay." And I could never order lunch, but I was given white bread. Now, whoever has had a piece of white bread as a sandwich, I would have white bread, no butter, a piece of cheese, a piece of ham. That was it. And I would sit while John would go through a book of drawings. And every lunch was usually once a week. He would say, "Fresh." Yeah, and that term has no rejoinder. And so for all the intellectual and conceptual and energy that the pedagogy here was, there was also the side of humanity. And John was a great human. And for me, that's what made this school possible. But,
Who else? You want to talk about drawing?
Okay, I want to talk.
Actually.
Okay.
To take, do you want to start?
No, it's fine.
John could enter a review and just raise an eyebrow. And I always thought that if I were to write or make a film of John Haydock, I would write about his eyebrows. They could express joy, they could express disgust. You knew that he was thrilled with something by the torque of his eyebrow, or that he was utterly dismayed with it. I like what Peter said very much about how it all began in Texas, because in a way, I would not be in the School of Architecture if it weren't for the Texas Rangers. One of them being Bob Slutsky, who was my old friend from when we were just out of Cooper. And then we lost touch, this and that. One day, I'd been invited to be interviewed for a job in the art school, and I'm riding up in the elevator, and there's Bob Slutsky. "What are you doing here?" I say, or he says, or we say simultaneously. And he says, "Well, I'm teaching here." And I said, "Well, I'm being interviewed for a job." And that's sort of how it began. 4 or 5 years later, I still was in the art school. And happily, one of the students I had in the days in the art school was Toshiko Mori. The room was the Peter Cooper suite. But in any event, I was summoned to John's office because John had said, "I want someone who can teach the figure." And Slutsky then said, "That has to be Gussow." And I was very reluctant, because I thought, what do I want to teach architecture students for? What are they interested in drawing? But John had a vision, and his vision was, I think, like none other. Yes, architecture students in other schools might take a class in, say, a nearby art department where they maybe did some figure drawing, but to John, the idea of the body was essential. So I was sort of dragged in there and persuaded that this was going to be a very good idea for the School of Architecture, and I didn't know what a good idea it would be for me to be involved with this extraordinary man and this extraordinary school. And the humanity, I think, that the study that the students garnered from looking at human bodies and understanding, learning how to draw from their own bodies, learning how a body occupied space, how there was a kinetic involvement that I don't think could be gained any other way than by an intensive study of the figure located in space, the figure relative to the room, and then, of course, all the other studies that went along with it, going out in the spring and studying trees and understanding the bodies of trees and the space they occupied. And so it was, as Peter mentioned, it was oddly an autonomous practice. We were not serving any particular studio. We were drawing for the sake of drawing. And I think that preserved it and made it alive and special and extraordinarily valuable, I am told by graduates. Extraordinarily valuable, not just as a humanizing practice, but as opening the creative mind to what space really meant in a way that perhaps, the pure study of, drawing precisely with instruments, orthogonal spaces might not have given them that same space.
Well, of course, we can spend the night talking about John and his extraordinary personality, humanity, and genius. I want to, if we're going to make our personal histories, I came here, first I met John when he was preparing the show for his houses at the Fondation Le Corbusier. And I was at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, and I went with Kenneth Frampton, who was going to go talk to John Haydock. in a little office he had when he was building the renovation of this building. And I remember he thought, he said, he talked about how expensive the garbage collection was, having an office. And he was putting that, and it's the first time I met, John. And he has these little houses, and I said very sort of timidly, I said, well, I think your work is surrealist. And he looked at me and he said, how do you know? And that, I think, established some kind of connection there that ran under. There was something that we understood each other, and what had not been said. He had never said that. But for whatever reason, that's what I thought it was, and I think I explained, but I can't remember what I explained anyway. But I think what I'd like to bring back to the question of pedagogy and the moment, I think that to understand the Cooper, Peter's view, certainly because he was there in the very beginning, and I wasn't, and I came from outer space and had a very different background, so that's good and that's bad. The good is that I had a perspective. The bad is like I missed a lot of things. On the other hand, I was a different generation too, so that also gave me a different perspective on what these guys were doing. And I was teaching at Princeton, and then when I left Princeton, I was a fellow at the Institute, and I was doing some teaching there. And so one day, I was doing these urban projects, and Peter said, why don't you show your students' work to John? And I came with a roll of paper, big roll. And I showed John the work, and he offered me a position, and I've been here ever since. And the extraordinary thing about John is that while people thought it's true, he was the absolute leader of everything. But on the other hand, I think there was a generosity of spirit in allowing people to develop voices. I think he was interested in hearing different voices because it made him think. And I loved hearing him because it made me think. And he always came from left side. Is that how the expression, left side, Peter? Football? Left field, yeah, left field. And so he always came up with like the fresh, he came up with things in reviews. They said, where did he get that from? Which was, I always said, he is the artist because he has another logic. He had a different logic. And there was an extraordinary logic that I think was tacitly running and I think permeated through everything. And so in that, there was this spirit, but within that, people had possibilities of developing their voices. But I want to say that what looking retrospectively, and maybe it's autobiographical from more theoretical perspective, and therefore the pedagogy, is that the moment, and Guido talked about the criticality, the postmodern moment, or those early moments. And I think that the whole project was a postmodern project from the very beginning. And I think from the early stages, and maybe Hesley in Texas was also doing that, in the sense that there was, this was a reaction to the functionalist ideology in architecture that had been initiated in the early decades of the 20th century, but that was bankrupt by then. And after the Second World War, with the advent of systems theory, cybernetics and everything else, functionalism in architecture, and that's a seminar, so I'm not going to get into detail, but had gone as far as it could go, and it was over. Now, of course, people kept on happily doing what they were doing, but if you're a thinker, if you're an educator, if you're somebody who's seeing what you're doing, then people felt it. I felt it as a little student down somewhere south, and I guess other people felt it in other places. And I think the reaction was this exploration of form per se. And I think that that's the way I see this first phase that I missed because I wasn't here, but of course I'm quite familiar with focusing on the making of form, on the drawing as a tool for thinking, of the tool that would allow you to make these explorations that would say, no, we don't do this architecture as it's supposed to be, which is a little bit of a myth too, that there's this relationship with functional, with the program, with that. No, we're going to explore this for what it is, itself. It has its own right in itself, not depending on how functional it may or may not be, but it may relate to other things, to poetry, to literature, to instruments, or later on with the city to a lot of other different things. And I see in that sense that the first book and the second book that you talked about are, I agree with you in their difference. The first one is pure. It has that purity of focus. It's very focused. But also, it's a false purity because it is a drawing, the beautiful lines of all those drawings. But they're drawings that are really still in the functionalist tradition in that book. They're beautifully drawn, just like the others that are questioning the formal systems that were prevailing then. So in the second book, the drawing is more explicitly a tool itself for thinking and rethinking everything and new forms of drawing. If you want to explore what you're doing, keep on exploring architecture with even more voices, you need to have more forms of drawings and exploration. But people don't talk. I think one of the important things at Cooper where people were obsessed with was making models. And everybody knows Cooper, you make the best models ever, right? And it was very fetishistic, I have to say, very fetishistic. Who wouldn't? I mean, how couldn't it be? They're amazing models. And so this, what I want to say, just set up a context for this pedagogy and its transformation over the years. Because I think John changed too. He was also affected by what's going around from the first book to what became the second. They're 16 years apart. It's a lot of time for a lot of things to have happened. And so I think that John also changed in time. He may have started with neoplasticism and cubism and surrealism, but he ended more in a metaphysical spirit. So I think that that was just what I wanted to say.
So this is the last time I'm going to retell this line tonight, but thanks again to Guido for the rare experience of being the youngest person on a panel. It's been quite a while. So I have a couple of John anecdotes, and then I'd like to talk about the urban as part of the curriculum at Cooper. One of the strong memories I have of a period of John's deanship is the time when he had an anatomical model of a human torso on his desk. And it had, what to say, the genders were interchangeable. And when coming into his office for a chat, one would find at the edge of his desk, exactly where you were sitting, a plastic penis. Talk about something to which there is no rejoinder. That was my experience. I also think that I think John hired me initially because of the no-holds-barred stuff I was writing in the Village Voice, and he was very happy to see gods toppled. He wrote a great blurb for one of my books, which was Michael Sorkin hunts blackbirds, and he hunts them at night. This was fantastic. But I think the real reason for my endurance for 10 years at Cooper may have been my wife, Joan, who is Czech on her father's side and Italian on her mother's side. And John saw her as the embodiment of what he and Gloria had produced. And after he met Joan, I basically could do no wrong. Enough of the anecdotes. The first thing I taught at Cooper was the book learning course about urbanism. because I've always been interested in urbanism, and there was something not exactly satisfactory about teaching the city through the medium of lectures and readings. Not that it's unimportant, but I noticed a gap between what was going on in the classroom and what was going on in the studio. And always missed the kind of urbanism that I've been teaching for the last 30 years, since I left Cooper, or 20 years. I don't do chronology very well. And I think the absence of urbanism was a kind of avatar for the way in which the social was problematized in the work at Cooper. And I was always looking for the location of the social. And you know, part of the necessary recognition is that this was also a time in which architecture was being read too closely for social meanings that I don't think could be assigned to it, rather than reading the city, which is where those relationships were actually imminent. This has changed since my time, but in thinking back, I think perhaps the social, and by extension the urban, was present in much of the pedagogy at the school. And I'm thinking about some of the locations. It certainly existed in some of the programs, even the daffier ones, the typical, a house for a beekeeper and a serial killer, which is about exactly what happens in cities. Cities are engines that create juxtapositions, many of them accidental. And so here was a kind of an extreme instance of juxtaposability, and the student was given the problem of working it out, much like what happens in the city. The team teaching approach, I think, was also an interesting form of social relations that was exposed to students. And I remember my particular experience in fourth year when I was teaching with, among other people, Raymond Abraham, who I had a friendship with. We respected each other, but I was always perplexed by the logic of the team teaching, particularly in those instances where a student would be told one thing by a professor and 3 minutes later the opposite by another. I understood that could be productive, but I also understood it could be traumatizing. And I have to say, one of the things that took me a while to discover was that there was, in fact, a cohort of students who just didn't get it, who were absorbing all this kind of battering and high-minded language, and were in complete confusion and terror. So, I worked out a deal with Raymond, since we were both somewhat strong voices, which was that we would teach together, but not on the same day. Which worked out very well. We'd come together for the juries and have our disagreements there. The studio was also a kind of surrogate city, and the socialization that went on in that big room, in which people from many backgrounds coexisted, because they had a kind of material belief in common, I think that was very urban in its way. Again, Renata spoke about John and the social contract. Well, this was an environment in which social deals had to be cut. And the students helping each other out before a deadline, this was something very beautiful. I think St. Mark's Place it's right over there. One could learn more about urbanism and urbanity walking back and forth those couple of blocks than anywhere else, almost anywhere else on the planet. And I also think of the style of drawing that was very much in the foreground when I was here, which were those soft pencil drawings on mylar, incredibly smudged, multiple erasures, but these were drawings about the palimpsest, about the way in which one excavates layers and finds the embedded meanings. And I think this is very much what the city is as well. So I came to recognize that there was a kind of indigenous urbanity to the school and to the curriculum. And I am very happy to see that it becomes more and more explicit in teaching now.
I'm the world's worst mimic, so I'm not going to try and talk about John too much. I want to talk about the school he administered. And I think looking back on my years at the school here, thinking of memories almost like a little movie on YouTube where it lasts for about 15 seconds and you see the slider move across. And somehow, if one taped together all those YouTube movies, one would have a total recall of the 15 years I taught in this building. And one of my first students was Liz Diller. And she was designing a supermarket. That was the assigned problem. You weren't connected with that one, were you?
I was in charge of that studio, and I gave a suburban mall. And John looked at me and said, "A suburban mall?" I said, "Yeah."
Ah, yes, that's it.
It was a provocation, yeah.
But her project consisted of a glass-roofed supermarket where the cars would park on the roof.
Yeah, it was a brilliant project.
A brilliant project. And when you looked up at night time, you would see white headlights moving around above your head and the red tail lights as well. And coming to New York, as I did from Newark, from NJIT, I was amazed at the drawings Michael started talking about, which were then proliferating. And I don't know, you know mylar? It's a plastic material which is very unfriendly when you draw the first pencil line on it. And something happens to the mylar as the days go by. It becomes very friendly, very soft, very inviting. And the lines which look so crude initially now look elegant and beautiful. And you go on working on it, and the students might have had one sheet of mylar on their drawing boards for about 3 or 4 weeks. And given the air pollution levels in New York City at that time, the grime building up on them, encrusted on them, was such that if you had to erase, you would suddenly, where you would erase, have this beautiful white, pure area of, the light was such as only Vermeer can put onto a canvas, I thought. And I was amazed at this sort of way of drawing. But one of the other YouTube memories is of entering the building one evening around about 8 o'clock at some time during the early 90s, and the student came up to me and started talking about these mylar drawings. And I said, fine, and we had a nice conversation about them. And I suddenly said to him, "Why are you talking to me about these drawings?" He said, "Well, I've got a review at 11 a.m. tomorrow morning with the dean, and I want to have one of these drawings done. Is there a way I can manufacture it overnight?" And I think the recognition of that drawing, of that moment, was telling, that what it was saying was, when you define a movement or a school within a school, the movement is dead. And I knew at that moment we had to stop drawing in this ridiculous way. And so that brought about the demise of that way of making a drawing. But I just want to end actually with one short memory of John, which chosen by me because it doesn't involve doing his accent. But this was an introduction to a lecture given by someone whose name I won't mention here. But the chap who lectured brought along some glass slides, and it made John think about the history of slides, of glass negatives, which if you dropped them would shatter, and there was your lecture gone. Gradually changing into becoming paper slides, which you could throw around the room and it didn't matter, and he tore one in half. So John's introduction to this lecturer was overcome and overwhelmed by his sudden interest in the nature of slide projection. And I could see the lecturer starting to feel slightly uncomfortable and squirming around. But anyway, the introduction lasted about 25 minutes, and it was far more interesting than the lecture that followed. So there's my comment about John.
I'm not sure if we have any more time. I cannot see any signal here. I want to point out one thing. My, let's say, interest, my objective in proposing this question was to try to overcome something that most of the comments that have been given today, this evening, right now, seems to reproduce. And this is, for me, is a little bit of a problem. There is this tendency to consider the kind of biographical condition or presence of ADOC within the school, which was absolutely crucial, fundamental, and essential for the spirit of the place. But in doing so, there is something that remains constantly obfuscated, opaque, that is then an overall sense of the pedagogy of the school. And I say this one because often in comments that I hear in conversation which I'm involved or asked to discuss, there are two phenomena that happen. One is Cooper Union is compressed into one single big elements that contain the first embodiment, let's say, of the school with the 9-square grid or the fractional houses or the wall houses, together with a series of completely different exercises like the work on the analysis, the work on certain urban project and so on. So this is, for me, is one of the problems that I wanted to address, marking the passage from one instant of the school into the other one. The other thing is that often the school is characterized with categories that are often, I would say, dismissive in a way, that either the school is defined as a poetic or autobiographical or introspective or even narcissistic. And we had this kind of comment, especially in the occasion of the exhibition on the thesis work during the comment. So I think it's very important to try, and that was, I think that part of the comment with Diana and Michael addressed these things, is really to try to define what is and how can be outline the identity of this place at the moment that had, in fact, multiple personalities, not a couple of them, but as many as the faculty that were here. And what it meant as a school, what it meant in terms of thinking a school as a community, thinking a school as convey a certain kind of, not only pedagogical practice, but also, I would say, in a broad sense, and maybe even in a not less broad sense, a political message, a moment of resistance to certain events or certain kind of attitude that was present outside of the school. So if we have time for a very brief other round, and again, I cannot see anybody or any signal. Okay, so that was the signal.
Okay, I just want to add one thing to what you said.
Okay.
We have just 1 second. Is that one of the things that I think remained, and I think it still does, although now we're talking about a particular period, which is that one covered by the database to now, which is up to 1990,000. So we're a few years past that. But I think that what remains, what was there at the core, is that this is a school for asking questions. It's a school for process. It's never been a curriculum geared, yes, yes to learning, yes, you need to know your trade, and we've been accused many times that students are not prepared to go into offices when they left Cooper, which is not really true. But I think that what's important is that it's never been a problem-solving school. It is a school where the spirit has always been one of exploration, obsessive. I remember the explorations on section over and over and over, and so from instruments to animals to section. I remember the section of Uccello that John Hayter gave for thesis. So there were different ways in which they're always trying to explore, to take apart, to reveal what was the making of architecture, what is it in the production of architecture. And I think that is part of it's a certain integrity and certain, not just looking out for what's the latest thing going on, but really to focus on the making, on the looking really intently into what each of the problems entails and what are the different aspects that can be done. And so the tools that made Cooper well known for the drawings and the models, all these beautiful objects that were produced and are still being produced, had a very strong background, pedagogical background, a philosophical background, and I think that's what people call the ethos. But I think we should not forget that, and that's what I want to say.
My 1 sentence?
Your 1 sentence.
Okay.
Your one sentence.
I'll speak, well, before my 1 sentence, one observation, which is it's not unsurprising that Liz did a project about cars for a man who has had a torrid romance with the automobile for over 70 years. But what I think is brilliant about Cooper is that the end product, the thing you pin up on the wall, you could either see it as a fetish object or possibly as the culmination of a process rather than something that describes something to ensue. The drawing is the end. And what Cooper tells people is it could be.
It could be, but not.
Yeah.
But not. And so I think what was brilliant in the curriculum and in the pedagogy and in the very nature of the continuance of drawing and using the hand is that the activity of freehand drawing is search. The very nature of it is search, and I think if we could think of only one word to define Cooper in the past and going into the future, it is search. It is not conclusion.
And on this.
Thank you. So, for the second panel, we will focus on the impact that the pedagogy of Cooper Union has had on teaching and the discipline of architecture at large. Most of these figures have gone on to teach and lead other prominent institutions and in turn develop new debates and new forms of cultural engagement. Through them, we hope to better understand not only the role of translation, but also the innate heterogeneity of this culture and the ways in which it has been embodied through different academic cultures. This panel is composed of Stan Allen, former Dean of Princeton, the author of Points and Lines, among other seminal books and articles, Peggy Deamer, professor at Yale and a key voice who continues to challenge and redefine the role of practice and ethics in architecture, David Gersten, a dear colleague and acting dean at Cooper Union during key transitional years, Laurie Hawkinson, professor at Columbia University's GSAP with a phenomenal practice in collaboration with Henry Smith Miller, Bradley Horn, the director of the graduate program at the Spitzer School of Architecture and principal of Berman Horn Studio, Kyna Leski, former head of architecture at RISD and the author of The Storm of Creativity, and of course, Toshiko Mori, the former head of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and with the authorship of Immaterial, Ultramaterial, a key voice in the materials research platform at the GSD. To help moderate this group, I invite Tamar Zinguer of our own faculty at Cooper Union. Welcome.
Change it a little bit. Good evening. Let's see the time. So we're going to do it a bit differently. First of all, welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us tonight on this celebratory event. And I have 3 prompts, short prompts that we can use to have the discussion going. So I think we will do it a bit differently than the last panel. In preparation for this evening, I think there's an echo. In preparation for this evening, I have asked each of the panelists to send me a syllabus or the outline of a program that they have developed over the years, one that reflects their pedagogy and educational thought. I thought that perhaps I could find a common thread, a hidden common denominator among the great wealth of approaches that each of those practitioners and educators has developed. What I received revealed a breadth of approaches to materials, sites, systems, environments, and history, which made me reflect on the tremendous freedom of thought that was encouraged here, a constant quest for creativity and originality, which was sometimes too great a burden for an undergraduate student to bear. Still, in my reading your materials, 2 words stood out: immaterial and real. The immaterial investigations of Toshiko Mori's seminal Immaterial Ultramaterial Studios at Harvard, which resulted in her influential book of that name, the immaterial aspects of labor that Peggy Deamer described in her book, The Architect as Worker, versus, and of course there's other instances, the material imagination, for example, of David Gersten's work, versus Kyna Leski's insistence on ground and the haptic in her book, Making of Design Principles, and the studio programs that Laurie Hawkinson gives her students at Columbia, and she described them to me as real in capital letters, real world issues concerning infrastructure and climate change. So, Cooper's projects have long seemed to outsiders as sort of nebulous and atmospheric, but simultaneously extremely precise in detailing even the smallest plumbing details. So I want to ask you, how do your pedagogy and practice specifically mediate those 2 sides? I mean, they're not necessarily poles between the immaterial, the wish for extreme speculation, and on the other hand, today's urgencies and the real.
Well, I'll jump in. There was something I remember Bob Slutsky saying quite often about Cooper, and I think precisely in response to this view of Cooper that it was somehow disconnected from the real world, he would say, we're more real than the real world. And what I think he meant by that is, yeah, sure, I mean, the stock market is real, political discourse is real, but it has no rigor, it has no, I mean, it is actually, if you look at it closely, just fundamentally arbitrary and completely abstract. So I think when Slutsky said Cooper is more real than the real world, he was talking about a school that paid attention to things that did have a kind of material reality, a drawing in which the texture of the pencil on vellum was important as a kind of real thing. And this idea of the social contract as projects that would have real consequences in the world. So yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a lesson that I take away from Cooper, that if you want to do something radical, you actually have to be much more rigorous than if you simply follow a kind of conventional pathway.
Yeah, I think I remember as students and also as teacher at Cooper, we are studying poetry all the time. And in particular, he did cite a phrase from Apollinaire, which is in French, but in English translation it says, the greatest fantasy is what is close to the reality. And then John always said that the greatest fantasy imagination only can appear on a knife edge between what is real and what is imagined. So I think that's the kind of contrast. And also by studying poetry, we always understood that without the context of reality, there's no poetic imagination. And then an architect, how do we actually negotiate it? And I think the precision and rigor that Stan talks about is for us to locate that place.
I'm going to jump in for a second. In thinking a little bit about this event tonight, I started pondering what pedagogical practices in this kind of very heterogeneous landscape that we're in today resonated for me with some of what was happening at Cooper during John's tenure. And I started thinking about a group of educators and writers today, I think some of whom are teaching today at Cooper, who have been pushing back on what they think of as decades of systems thinking, what they characterize as Deleuzian flows, and are advocating a kind of return to objects, or return to things, or return to buildings. Some of these folks have been characterized as new materialists, etc. One of the things that strikes me in a lot of the writing that's produced by many people who are affiliated with this group is that some of the language could almost be mistaken for John's, in the sense that there's a characterization of material and objects and things as somehow being withdrawn or mysterious or strange. And I think obviously for John, there was a kind of a deep and profound mysticism, even alchemy at work in the way that he thought about material, the way he taught students to address and think about and kind of draw inspiration from material. Certainly something that this younger generation would be pushing back against, any form of essentialism or anything that had that kind of quality. Nevertheless, it's occurred to me that pedagogically the results are very similar, which is that it's a way of redirecting students away from the kind of oversaturation of data, information, and noise, and getting them to kind of muster more empathy for the mundane, the everyday, the things that are right in front of them. And so that's something I just want to posit as a way of attempting to build a bridge between things that were happening at Cooper and some of the tendencies that we're seeing today.
I maybe picking up on that, but also I think responding to what Stan was saying about what is real, and also filtering out other things so you can pay attention to what's kind of in front of you. I really appreciate your question, because when I was thinking, listening to the first panel about what I would say came out of this is absolutely that I learned about the real. In the real sense, I just remember when in cutouts where we were doing three-dimensional explorations of a two-dimensional image, and you get the color-aid paper, and I remember learning that the color-aid paper wasn't just the green of the field that the painting had in it, but it was this pigment, and it was white on the other side, that it was paper, that it wasn't just representation of other things. And it was, to me, that was kind of a profound lesson about the real, that there was a metaphorical thing that we were doing, but there was an absolute thing. But I guess maybe want to push back on Stan, when you're kind of saying, the stock market's not real. What I felt that I learned, and this relates to the immaterial, is that part of the real are these immaterial things that yield material results. And if you were really going to be looking at the real, like real estate, which had real results and real streets and real buildings, that you had to understand in some way the market, and that your dedication to that was understanding that the things that yielded that reel had processes that were mystical, fantastic, crappy, political, all those things. So I feel like I learned the reel went into those other things.
I just wanted to go back for 1 second and note the remarkable achievement of this archive. I think that Stephen Hillier and Kim Scappage and the decades of care, both in documenting the work and the kind of incredible amount of work to bring that out to the world, it really is it's a contribution to the history of architecture, and it's a contribution to the history of education. And I just wanted to say that and thank them again. And relative to this very beautiful question, what have we been doing here all these years, and what is its contribution? I think there are many forms of imagination: the material imagination, spatial imagination, the poetic imagination, and all of them allow us to ask incredibly challenging questions and to ask them with great nuance. Right? Meaning, I'm talking about the spectrum of ways of knowing, the spectrum of nuance that we address the challenges or the questions we face today. I often think of the real crises of our time. There are billions of people in vulnerable positions. And I think that those crises can be understood as crises of comprehension, crises that education in its deepest sense, and I'm talking about the kind of reciprocity of education and the ethical dimension of it, can bring incredible perception to how do we perceive these crises. And so our capacity to register transformation is even in question today because of the nature of transformation. And from my view, I've been a student here for 33 years. I'm a lucky duck. In my view, the layers of nuance in how these multiple forms of imagination that we've engaged here for a very long time, the very real condition of those is how they allow us to perceive transformation and, of course, to create transformation, right? To contribute to making a world that amplifies people's lives rather than diminishes them.
Okay, I was thinking about the building that we're in, and that we're in a building that is a very old building. I teach in a very old building also, and so you're always kind of working against the building in some way. But then this building had an opportunity to then be remade by Haydick, so we were in the building that he designed, which was also a very unusual situation to be spending so much time and working in a space that had that presence in it and infused with his thought because of his work on the building. And, when we were here, the building, I'm not to say it's not immaculate now, but it was immaculate, right? It was so perfectly maintained and everything. But then at the same time, you'd go up to the, I was thinking then also about on the building topic, because I build, and I think that way. But the studio, which was this great equalizer, because it was just this open space, with the big columns and the diagonal brace. But everybody was there in one space with the same table space. We all had the same thing, and it was, and there were no divisions, right? This is what you still have up there, but this is different than a lot of other places in that way. And then, of course, the thesis students were always kind of off, in the corner. But I think it was just that unique condition of being in that space that he designed as something that I wanted to bring up. And then I also wanted to think, there's this question of the social contract that Renata mentioned that I think affected me personally. And I think I probably, until I heard that, I wasn't kind of directly thinking about it, but the work that I do, or the work in the studios, the studio briefs that I've been involved with that involve infrastructure, and whether it's this, I use the word real because I think the real is almost so much more fantastic sometimes than anything we could ever dream up, right? What's really out there in the world, like the climate change situation, like who thought this? And so from that notion, then I'm going to kind of scramble around here for a minute and talk about, just to touch on what Stan mentioned about the drawing, or Toshiko's work on the immaterial and the material. The paper here, when it was mentioned that, when Kim mentioned that he was drawing on this paper, this notebook paper, it kind of cracked me up, because we were all drawing on this paper. I mean, we didn't use Mylar, but we were drawing on this paper. And when I unrolled my drawings for Stephen to try to look at them, they completely cracked because I hadn't opened them in X number of years and fell apart because we were in love with this crazy, I don't know what, it wasn't really a canson, but it had this kind of canson villon. So it was kind of, it became brownish, you know, we were using the lead, but the thing just didn't hold up. So that kind of cracked me up that we were working in this way on something that we put so much labor into, but then actually just kind of evaporated, which was probably fine. The lights are going out. I think they want to shut us down. So maybe Kyna wants to say something.
Oh, well, I mean, they became immaterial with time. I think in thinking about your question, I'm reflecting on how the lessons have transformed over the many, many years for me and the 30 years of teaching. And so I remember John Haydock saying, the imagination is real. And what I would characterize was very present was a kind of ethical, moral drive, the valuing the imagination, a real material culture, and the importance of poetry. And those things have become, in my most recent teaching, I've extended the context with which I use these gifts from Cooper, that they operate in a broader context now that is very real. And just to be a little more specific, the lesson of poetry now is transformed as an associative logic that is very valuable in terms of in times of crises, where you have to very quickly make choices and improvise. And the material culture leads to an ability, a sensibility, you know, that John Haydock even taught us about the surgeon's cut and how, you know, real that is, the feedback of touch through material and thinking through material. And that's, again, very real. The imagination is giving courage, of giving us a sense of something beyond the here and now that has a counterweight to the here and now. And how that gives courage. You can see that in like movements, the civil rights movements. And so these have become even more real, these lessons that are so much a part of my education. And the underlying all of it is this ethical, moral drive that was always clearly felt and communicated through Haydock.
Yeah, I too remember that continuously hearing that dreams are real because of the precision. I mean, what makes them real is their precision, and continuously hearing that you should make your drawings as real as dreams. And I think this leads me to the next question about representation, because I think it's impossible to not talk about the impact of Cooper and its legacy without addressing representation. And I'd like to mention an article that Stan wrote recently, John Haydock's Axonometric Degree Zero. It was published, to help me, where it was online?
The Drawing Matter, yeah.
In Drawing Matter in September, this September. And John Heyduk's axonometric degree 0 talks about the 90-degree angle axonometric, the projection made famous by John Heyduk, where the plan is rotated 90 degrees rather than 45 or 60, and is presented simultaneously with one elevation, one wall that seems hinged or folded from it. The other elevations are reduced to 0 as they cannot be seen. So according to Stan, Heyduk was preoccupied by the space of the projection itself, by the invisible, these are Stan's words, by the invisible rear faces that collapsed onto the visible front faces, a simultaneity of front and back, which for him implied a kind of deep space compressed within the surface of the drawing. For Heyduk, Stan wrote, "It is the close fit between the projection system and the architectural ideas that matter." And Stan speculates that perhaps without the 90 degrees axonometric, privileging one facade or wall, there would have been no wall houses, perhaps, in Heyduk's work. In my own work, I'm investigating architecture degree 0, and among other things, I look at the works of a modernist architectural photographer called Hugo Herdeg, who was described by Siegfried Giedion as capturing the mystery of nearness and possessing the fanaticism to conquer the object at any price, the quality which critics explained as seeking the 0 point where representation and object fuse into one unshakable exact totality. I'm wondering if you could reflect on the character and role of representation in your pedagogy. How do you place representation relative to your architectural ideas? Do you seek that 0 point, the close fit between drawing and the architectural concept?
I shouldn't be the one to talk first, since you...
No, you talk last.
Oh, he's going to talk last. Okay.
Perhaps not last, but...
I mean, I'm not going to be the most profound on this, because I don't think my pedagogy really has to do with representation. But I will just say, in all the teaching in the studio that I've done, I completely bristle at realistic drawings, what we call renderings. I can't let my students do it. And, it definitely comes back to having learned here that you were not even going to learn perspective. We could only do axonometrics because that was truth as opposed to eyewash. And perspectives were all about seduction, and we weren't about seduction, we were about truth, which has never, ever left me. And so it's not that I make my students do axonometrics, but I certainly won't let them do a colored rendering, and there has to be, as part of the final project, as much contemplation about what the truth of their idea is in its appropriate form that isn't about what it looks like, but is about its concept. But I'm not saying anything profound. I think everybody would say the same thing.
I think he used the word language rather than using a word representation about each student's expressions, and then my memory, and also I think I carry that point of view to encourage each person's personality, but then within that there's a framework of representation systems in which we have a common language that we shared. I think that's actually the kind of pedagogy that he was after, and I think I'm carrying it through. And it's a very abstract notion, but the drawings and expressions and languages are something very abstract, but it has a sense of universality that we all shared, yet it had your own personality expressed in it. And in it, in intellectual sense, what it is a representation is actually collapsed space. And I don't think he ever perceived drawings as a two-dimensional entity. I think there's this spatial entity, and there has been a depth within the flatness, and that's why I think this attraction to axonometric as opposed to the blatant expression of forced depth in perspective, for example. So there's incredible fullness in understanding the relationship of space and language. Within it is the tonality he talked about, texture, the very thin, the 4H lens to very thick black poche, the degree of how we make expressions within the languages, which is limited, but then infinite. I think that's the kind of idea that I take away from that, from your question.
I think also, I was thinking about the models, because we're talking about the drawings, but I think the models also afford that because there's a limit to how much one can, how real it can be, right? And so that was this huge kind of trick in a way, so that you're representing something, but you're representing only specific aspects of something in a model, because you can only capture certain, concepts in whatever the material is or whatever the agenda is for the model, and each model always has an agenda. But so it's limiting in the way that the axonometric was limiting, and I think it produced, or I think it produces a way of thinking, and I really appreciate. It's not the craft of the model; it's the use of the model in working through ideas, really, that was explored here.
Well, just to say, I don't want to stop, but I think part of what was interesting about that is, both with the drawings and with the models, but I think about it, particularly when you emphasize models, that the models weren't just a limited representation of an idea. They were objects in and of themselves, and they understood their own limiting capacity, and in that understanding their limiting capacity had their own joyousness, or had their own possibilities of saying something not directly about what you were trying to represent, but about what model making was and what that thing was. But.
No, I just wanted to add, I think in the last panel, Sue brought up the word searching, and that is kind of a sort of ethos of the place. And I think here, the state of drawing, for many years I've taught the first year, and I always tell the students not to make a drawing to show something, but to see something. And that sort of subtle but profound inversion, where drawing itself becomes a kind of site of exploration. Right? Drawing is a place to search, as is your studio. And I also think, relative to representation, that a drawing can be of something, but it always is something. And that question of the isness of a drawing and its relationship or reciprocity or vibration with what it's of, I think has always been a very important part of this place. And that, of course, has to do ultimately in a way with voice. I mean, it's something else I could bring in here, in the sense that, and literally, I could actually start literally with voice, in the sense that voice is breath. It's our breath mingling with language, and every voice is different. And the way in which our breath mingles with our language creates a kind of a way of searching through our voice. And I think drawings have the exact same condition, right? They're substance that's mingling with language, and it's creating space. And each drawing has a voice. And the more that we try to see or listen to what the drawings have to say, then the more we're discovering. And I think in a way that's an enormous contribution to understanding, literally to understanding each other and understanding the world.
So I agree with this use of the word language, in place of representation, and perhaps that's because we learned that here. And there was a conceptual rigor in the development and choice of language, as well as a voice. But I think and I think it was also very much alive at that time, in the 80s. But I also felt for myself somehow that the lesson that I was getting within the architecture school, coupled with taking physics, and not, basically before coming here, I did physics at another school and didn't do very well, but then I did very well here because I somehow finally understood I have to work in the language, which is mathematics, and that you're not translating, you're not representing physical phenomena, you're working in its language. And that same lesson was happening here, and so there's a propelling function of the language, that it's not looking back and representing something else that's happening somewhere else. It is thought itself, right? So the language propels the thoughts.
I mean, one response to your comment, Tamar, was a question of context, where in order to think about architecture as axiomatic, which I think things like 090 or the diamond becoming the wall house and all of those things, I think in order to be able to think about architecture that way, there was much about the Cooper education which also was sort of narrowly circumscribed. There was a boundary, right? And I think about the archive, and I think about the fact that there are those transcripts from thesis, right? So on one hand, you have this magical, very speculative, very beautiful creative work. And then you read the transcripts of thesis, and there's a tone in there quite often that the world outside the doors of the school is fundamentally threatening, whether that be the profession or other things, right? And so to me, I can't think of drawing practices, or I can't isolate certain representational techniques or certain attitudes about space from some of the more sort of maybe contradictory layers as well that sort of produced that possibility, right? So I think there was a degree to which students felt, I know that often I felt, like we were very autonomous. We were a kind of island experimenting with particular practices, but they didn't necessarily communicate beyond the boundary or the borders of the school out into the quote-unquote world. So I'm just positing that. I was curious what my colleagues felt about that.
Yeah, maybe I'll shift the tone just slightly. Because I think there's I very much appreciated Guido's characterization of the transformation of the school that took place in the late 70s, which was the time that I encountered Cooper. I was here from 78 to 81. The class I graduated, I came in as a transfer student, so I didn't do first year. The class I graduated with was the last class to do 9-square grid. It was during the time I was here that John Haydick and Bob Slutsky fell out because Haydick had invited Aldo Rossi to the school, which to Slutsky was complete anathema to that neoplastic vision from the 70s. And there was what also has been mentioned before, this kind of proliferation of voices, people like Jay Fellows, people like David Shapiro, P. Adam Sitney, and Bernard Schumi teaching in the school briefly. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it was kind of a confused period, actually. We were caught in the middle of this transition. We always looked back on the kind of coherence of the work of the 70s with a certain amount of nostalgia, I think, actually, in my own case. Maybe it coalesced later, I don't know, I wasn't around. I will tell one anecdote, which I thought was telling about the kind of differences there. When I was doing my thesis, I was doing a very large section, again, on opaque paper, cream-colored opaque paper. Mylar was forbidden, by the way. I don't know where the Mylar thing comes from. That was later, I guess, too. You would draw on opaque paper because you weren't tracing through. You had to construct the drawing on the surface. And, of course, the cream-colored paper allowed me to do, with a ruling pen, the poche in white ink, white gouache, I think it was. And night before the review, I spilled a bottle of white gouache in the middle of my drawing. And I cut out a section of the drawing, and I stitched it all back together, and I drew a crane where the gap had been in the drawing. And I have the drawing up on the wall, and Bernard and Haydick are there, and Bernard says, "What happened there?" And I explained I spilled a bottle of ink. And Bernard's response is, oh, that's too bad you ruined the drawing. Hayek said, that's the most beautiful part of the drawing. And, there was, there's a perception from the outside sometimes that Cooper is a monolithic place, and that's not the case. And I think, I don't know, Laurie can speak to this, but I think at that particular time, there was a lot of internal debate and discussion and disagreement. And, I think it was probably productive for us as students. Michael Sorkin mentioned, hearing your thesis critics tell you it's the exact opposite. That certainly happened to me. So it was certainly not a monolithic pedagogical ethos.
And I had Bernard for something like 3 classes.
Yeah.
In a history class that started with and ended with constructivism. But anyway, it was, I was thinking about the pinups too, or the reviews, in that compared to what happens, like there's, Harvard or Columbia or Yale, there were almost none, 0 guest critics. So there would just be critics from within. Everybody was from within, but there still was this disagreement. There was not a kind of cohesive, I would agree, not a kind of cohesive agenda, although Hayek was, always kind of hovering in the back and saying stigmata or something, at some moment.
But then I was at Cooper 70 to 76, 6 years, because I was in art school for 1 year and transferred, so I got 6 years of free education. But that I was previous to that period, also people like Poshak are teaching, Richard Meyer were teaching, Todd Williams, Sam Brody, so it's incredibly diverse aspects of, and then Bernard came in. And then I remember and Raymond Abraham started, and Hayek was very young, and everybody had huge arguments. And we were confronted with it. As a students, all we could do is duck the bullets. And then, in a way, you really see a true confrontation, but passionate arguments, which I don't see today anywhere in academia. And then, in a way, I was scared, but students also stood up, and I had a huge arguments with Slutsky, and I had to go out with him afterwards to have drinks in Maxoli to make up. It's like we were like in it all together. And there's a passion with the student was incredible. And I have to embarrass Brad, because when Brad was a student, he was one of the very youngest ever. And Hayek couldn't believe the way you speak today, because your first presentation, Brad, if you remember, you were wearing torn t-shirt. The first project, you burned it to the ground in front of everybody, saying, the work in the ashes of thoughts. So there's this really amazing, energy. And that was part of this seriousness and passion, and differences were not negotiable. I think that's what I remember as something quite severe, but in a sense scary, but amazing experience.
I think I'll jump in because we have to wrap up soon, but I want to just, what you're describing is a little bit like a family, and I think...
dysfunctional family.
And in families, there are taboos, there are things that you don't mention, and when I was in school here, there were things you could not talk about, and this was the height of postmodernism, but you could not say it. You could not say the word, you could not acknowledge that it was happening, you could not open magazine. It was the Humana building by Michael Graves was being built, it was over everywhere, Philip Johnson's on 3rd Avenue. There was absolutely, you could not mention it. I know that it affected me. The moment I got to Princeton as a graduate student, I immediately wanted to TA for Michael Graves, which I did, and I went and got all my kitchen utensils at Target. But I was wondering, what were the unmentionables in your time? If there were any. I think you mentioned already you could not draw perspectives, and you could not.
I think also text on drawings. I don't know if other people had this experience, but it's almost a complete reversal now, because there were never any words.
No name either.
There were no
words. You could not write
no
your name ever.
I don't know.
I think the word style probably was one. You couldn't talk about style because we were all doing something that transcended style. Yeah, so it wasn't just postmodernism. Even the idea that architecture was bound up in styles, and you didn't look at the Renaissance as a style. You looked at the Renaissance as, as a profound lesson. I just remember when I started teaching soon after I graduated, and I was on a review, and somebody next to me said, "Oh, modernism's just a style." It was like, what? Because I had never heard that in my years here. So, anyway.
We couldn't talk about the digital.
What?
About the digital.
No digital?
No. Well, it was emerging.
Okay.
Well, in fact, I don't remember the term representation being used.
No.
I mean, you talked about drawing. I mean, representation belongs to a different intellectual world. So,
That's true.
I just wanted to say, relative to the question of Jay Fellows and David Shapiro and Ramo Guidieri and the poets and the anthropologists and the literary figures, I think there's something that it's important to point out that I think the project during that time and its relationship to the project of this great hall is pretty important. I think that the social political project of the Cooper Union, I'm talking about the Cooper Union as a project, relative to porosity, to removing barriers, to opening up and creating interactions. And I think its relationship to the idea of doing that with a discipline, meaning the idea that we had surgeons and we had a judge and we had poets and anthropologists as all engaged in that debate, and the fact that the humanities was really recognized as a kind of key foundation of the discipline of architecture, specifically ways of imagining others, imagining inhabitation, anticipating inhabitation, thinking of that as something deeply grounded in the humanities. I think that is one of the great links to Peter Cooper, to the social political project of the Cooper Union. And it lived for decades in that architecture project.
Thank you. I think we gotta wrap up. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Elizabeth O'Donnell, and thank you all for joining us for the celebration of this significant milestone in the life of the School of Architecture. My closing remarks will be very brief, as we want all of you to join us on the third floor to continue the conversation at a reception and to invite you to test drive the database, which will be available on desktop computers along the west wall of the big studio. But first, additional thanks and acknowledgements. First, my many thanks to the panelists and to all of our speakers, Guido, Diana, Peter, Sue, Michael Webb, Michael Sorkin. Thank you for your reflections on your experience of the school and what we can now consider providing the first reading of the Architecture Archive database. Toshiko, David, Laurie, Bradley, Kyna, and Tamar, Stan, Peggy, and for so many of you in the audience, thank you for your contributions to the school as students and to your unwavering commitment to architecture since that time. Your individual impacts on the discipline and practice of architecture have been real, significant, and recognized in myriad ways, and your work is yet another measure of the power of the project of the education of architects here at the Cooper Union. Thank you, Kim, for being with us tonight. But even more, thank you for your work, begun over 35 years ago. With John, you were able to recognize what the School of Architecture Archive could become, and you understood then what it physically needed to be. You were every job in the archive: the director, the archivist, the designer, the photographer, the editor. You were its architect and its builder, and you constructed the foundation for a project that has by now outlasted many buildings in this city and will continue to grow long into the future. And our thanks again and admiration to our current School of Architecture Archive Director, Stephen Hillier, who has been indefatigable in his advocacy for the school and its educational project, supporting and advancing that project through a commitment to building its record, an archive of its student work. It was Stephen who proposed the project of creating a publicly accessible archive with the intention of being able to say that, with only a very few exceptions, here is all of it. And it is not just for architects or alumni or researchers and teachers, but for anyone to discover, to browse, to read, to critically examine, to trace lines of thought, to argue, to debate. With his exceptional team, Caitlin, Chris, Leah, and an incredible team of student assistants, almost 15,000 unique images have been digitized, cataloged, assigned attributes, and brought into the public realm. In this regard, Stephen, you were the architect and the urbanist. You, in making the archive publicly accessible, have created a kind of civic space, and for that we are so grateful. To our funders, thank you for your generous support for acknowledging the social, cultural, and educational value of an archive of architecture student work, for understanding the ambitions of this audacious proposal. What has become more clear than ever to me this evening through the conversations on stage is that the pedagogy and curriculum of the School of Architecture, especially during the 25-year deanship of John Haydick, was never singular nor static. It was always conceptual, intentional, and expansive, but it was always changing. And there have been periods of change that were evolutionary and times of seismic change in this pedagogy and point of view. As the school moved during the period of time documented in the archive, from a series of tightly controlled studies to a constellation of heterogeneous investigations into the form, program, and meaning of architecture and the means by which it is analyzed, designed, and represented. And these regular shifts in pedagogy and point of view were long before computational methods and practices of design and image making came onto the scene. The second is that the archive project itself, and especially now with its public release, is not a project of looking back or one of fetishizing historic objects, but given its cataloging strategies, becomes similar to the project of analysis in the school, a didactic, structural, and even abstract process, at once both interpretive and projective, a potential referent and motivator for the current work being done at the school. So a brief few words about current work. At this moment in the school's history, as we work to return to full tuition scholarships for all students in the next 7 short years, and at this moment in the world, I think there is perhaps nothing more important than the continued advocacy and stewardship of an educational community committed to the integrity and vitality of a discipline. The maintenance of our schools as places of independent thought and action, of creative risk-taking, with a belief in facts, and the commitment to developing the knowledge and skills necessary to distinguish facts from, well, alternate facts, and spin at all scales. And while a visit to the studio today will reveal real and significant differences in the student work now from that of 20 years ago, there are just as many obvious continuities. They are continuities of thought, process, design, and community. That the development of an idea is inseparable from the development of the skills by which those ideas must ultimately be argued. That method is not the same as technique, but fundamental to building intellectual and conceptual clarity. That our students are seeking to be prepared not for a profession as practiced, but towards a radically new mode of practice, both in and outside the discipline, practices yet to be invented. that drawing and model making of all kinds, and there are many and beautiful examples of this in the studio, are still investigated as practices with deep historic and disciplinary significance, that the most radical of speculation requires the utmost specificity and precision of articulation. Our students are from all over the world. They are fully present, they are eager, open, skeptical, and incredibly hardworking. I can assure you, they are also deeply committed to their education and to being a part of the educational project that is the Cooper Union. We look forward to their work becoming part of and anchoring the extraordinary project of the database as it moves forward. And now, for the moment we've all been waiting for, the database is now live. It is now available to all of you on your computers, your cell phones, and however else you may browse. And the URL is behind me. It's super easy to remember. So it's archstudentworkcollection.cooper.edu. Please enjoy, thank you, and please come up to the third floor where we'll have a reception together and you can test drive the database. Thank you so much for coming.